Well, federal police have launched a major new crackdown on the Calabrian Mafia.
We learned today that many criminal gangs terrorising our streets are nothing but puppets, all controlled by the Mafia in Italy.
On the first anniversary of Operation Ironside, which saw the AFP smash bikie and organised gangs, it's now time to go after the most feared criminal network in the world, the Mafia.
The Australian Federal Police have revealed some new information they say they've uncovered about the Mafia here in Australia.
Yeah, so the Italian Mafia is obviously probably the most famous historical
crime organisation, yeah.
Yeah, crime organisation in the world, and it's probably something that I think a lot of people think is outdated, but that's definitely not the case. The Federal Police are saying that there is 5,000 members linked to the Italian Mafia in Australia currently, across 51 clans, 14 of them who they specifically are looking at and planning on targeting. And this all kind of stems back to the Anom app, which was, as we know, that encrypted application that acted as something of a Trojan horse for so many of the world's big criminals who were told that it was the best encryption app that has ever existed, foolproof. Police couldn't get to it, and the whole time it had actually been set up by authorities who were reading every word about the murders, drug imports and criminal activities that they planned. And so it was about a year ago that they carried out the first big range of raids, and the AFP stood up now and has said, okay, we've done that, we've targeted the Comancheros and a lot of big bikie gangs, and our next target is the Italian Mafia.
See, I remember in the 80s, the Mafia, or the links, were known very well in the Australian media. We talked about the Griffith and the Mafia, and they talked about grass castles. Yep. And those were these mansions that they built through Griffith and then in suburban Sydney. All their big stock in trade then, that we all believe was mainly marijuana. It was mainly through the grass trade, amassed millions and millions of dollars. Then they seem to have gone quiet. There were some big busts of MDMA, which there were very famous names, the Pasquale Barbaro name, the Sergios. These were huge names, and like in America, the Mafia was feared and scared of and petrified. But in the last decade, very few people would be thinking of such a presence of the Mafia here in Australia. We tend to think of the bikies as organised crime, Middle Eastern organised crime, even Asian organised crime, and the Italians, particularly with the Mafia, have kind of faded in the background. As I said, they exploded on the scene in the 80s and 90s. They got a lot of publicity and died down. But it appears, from what the Federal Police have been saying today, that has been a tactic really to keep that low key.
They've been able to stay under the radar by living modest lives in modest homes. They funnel their illegitimate wealth into their legitimate construction, agricultural and catering businesses.
Completely, and we talk a lot, particularly in Sydney, but we see it pretty much all over the country about bikies, criminal syndicates, modern day criminal syndicates, and they have a love of the life of luxury, fast cars, big houses, expensive, designer outfits. And I think this goes to what you were talking about before, and it seems to be a bit of a trend or a trap that becomes anybody who, gets into organised crime and is hit with a big whack of funds in their pocket that maybe they didn't have previously, as we saw with the Italian Mafia back in the 80s and 90s. But the Federal Police said that over those years, historically, they've become smarter and more disciplined. And while it looks like they've died down, they've been living in modest houses in suburbia, living modest lives, taking their illegitimate money and funneling it into massive legitimate corporations, building, catering, big businesses like that. And so they've become much smarter and operated, much more smartly than some of these organised crime networks by laying low, under the radar, appearing not to be as heavily involved. But the federal police say, and Moz, you've been doing this a long time, be interested to get your thoughts, but the federal police say that they are continuing to dominate the cocaine market. 70 to 80% of what comes into Australia is pulled, the strings are pulled by the Italian Mafia, and they are controlling bikie gangs like the Comanchero, who we talk about as being the most powerful crime organisation in Australia at the minute.
Yeah, as I said, it took me a bit by surprise. Not that the Italian Mafia operating here in Australia, that it would be obvious. They operate all over the world and they have been for decades. But to the extent to say that involved in 70% of the trade here, pulling the strings of the bikie groups, that's what's taken me a bit by surprise. I thought, we know the bikies and get in bed with anybody for their distribution, but to that extent, it seems, as I said, it's a bit of a shock. I'm not doubting the federal police. As I said, I'd like to see a little bit more of the proof. It'd be quite amazing. We've got guys like Mark Buttle, who we believe, is bringing in heaps of gear. Turkish. There's a Turkish mafia, basically, very strong Turkish criminal network here, also connected to the bikies. They've got a strong presence in Hells Angels, Lone Wolf. They've been bringing in their gear. Now, I did not see, and maybe that's how clever the Italian Mafia is with their connections here. You never heard of that connection here. There's no doubt the distribution networks, they have transportation companies, which would go back to Griffith. That's where it all originated from, They're in Adelaide, and that's where they would distribute their drugs throughout Australia. So maybe they've just used those networks, but just kept it a lot quieter.
Yeah, totally. And I spoke to a federal source before who said, they when I kind of raised that thing about, it seems like they've been laying low, they said, no, we've been watching them, and they have been meeting face to face with members of bikie gangs, including the Comanchero, who we talk about a lot, but they are such a big deal when it comes to drug supply and drug trafficking and drug running in Australia. So they're clearly still entrenched, and the AFP have in some ways put them on notice. And I know that there has been, it's obviously a really old business, and the AFP talked about the fact that there are familial links dating back not only decades but centuries in terms of the mafia and back to Italy. So people who are here in Australia have, they marry close by, they are disciplined in the people that they deal with and communicate with and trust, and, their relationships back to the homeland.
Yeah.
But they, like many organisations, have come unstuck because of Anom.
Yeah, which it'll be interesting to see if they're going to target them now that they've made this announcement. When do we start seeing the arrests and the connections being drawn? We've known about families existing here for a long time, and those clans, but how deeply involved they were in the drug trade is a bit of a revelation. And now those revelations are going to have to be backed up with arrests. So that'll be really interesting to see if we start seeing a lot more people from those Italian links supposedly being around. And they'll be second and third generations. They probably won't even speak Italian, like me. So I'll be really interested to see where this goes with the federal police.
The disappearance 2 years ago of Donald Bruce Mackay fanned waspish feeling against Italians in Griffith. After all, a few of them had recent convictions for growing marijuana, and Don Mackay was renowned for his hostility to the drug.
So when we think of the mafia, is this, hits and murders, John Gotti? What are your recollections?
Back here,
experiences.
The most famous here in Australia, there was the Robert Trimboli clan, huge, in Griffith, and Trimboli, huge punter, but well known to be a connection in the mafia. Now then, his hometown, Donald Mackay, was a local guy there who was running for office, but anti-drugs campaigner. He was just relentless in fighting drugs and talking about the the drug trade in Griffith, and he just wouldn't let up, and he just vanished. And they found his car was found empty near his furniture store, a bit of blood. The person was actually charged with conspiring to murder him. No body's been ever found. And you talk in Griffith, you talk the Mafia, Donald Mackay, and that mystery is still talked about. It was a real act of intimidation to anyone that dared to talk about the Mafia in Australia. And Robert Trimboli fled the country and then was found. He eventually died in Spain, I think. But it showed you what... That was really the first political death that the Mafia was linked to quite openly in Australia.
But it's funny too, isn't it? Because that's, it's in Griffith, it's in a regional town. It's not a capital city where we so often think of these, groups operating. And obviously the Mafia stems back to Italy, but then has its big roots in New York. So they have been happy to lay low and operate outside the box to a degree.
And you would see, as I said, these guys didn't live very flash then at all. And it was then the second and third generation when we had a famous guy here, Pascal Barbaro. The Barbaro family has been linked to the Mafia and the drug trade in Australia for decades. Yeah. There's been 3 Pascal Barbaros executed. Yeah. And the last one here was in Sydney about 5 years ago. And he lived a very flashy life, and that was frowned upon by the old guys back in Griffith. They didn't like it. In fact, he was a bit ostracised because he drove flashy cars, had lots of jewellery. The old-fashioned Mafia was like the ones back in the 30s and 40s. They were considered very quiet businessmen. John Gotti was another one that people didn't like. The old guys didn't like because of that flashiness. Yeah.